It's November 1st, 1831, and 17,000 Choctaw people are ripped from their homes in Mississippi, forced to march through a brutal winter with nothing but a handful of boiled corn and 2 cups of water a day. A chief staggers into Little Rock, looks a journalist dead in the eye, and says this has been a trail of tears and death. By the end, up to 6,000 are gone, starved, frozen, or lost in swamps. And that's just the start. This wasn't some natural disaster. It was a plan, signed into law on March 28, 1830, by Andrew Jackson, a man who'd been hunting native tribes since his army days. The Smithsonian calls it genocide, but was it really just greed for gold and cotton fields, or something darker? How did this happen, and why hasn't America owned up to it? On March 28, 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law. This wasn't just some quiet piece of legislation slipping through unnoticed. It was a bombshell, a plan to uproot entire native tribes from their homes in places like Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, lands they'd held through treaties with the U.S. government for years. The destination was a stretch of territory way out west beyond the Mississippi River, what's now Oklahoma. They called it Indian Territory back then, like it was some fresh start. But for the people being forced out, it was anything but. This law didn't come out of nowhere. It was the boiling point of a long simmer, a push to clear the Southeast for settlers who'd been eyeing those lands with dollar signs in their eyes. Picture the scene. Congress was a battleground over this. It wasn't a quick vote and done deal. People stood up, voices raised, arguing over what this would mean. Davy Crockett, the Tennessee congressman, you might know from Frontier Tales, wasn't having it. He flat out said his vote against it was something he'd stand by till his last day. No regrets. Then there was Jeremiah Everts, a Christian missionary who saw this for what it was, a grim vision of a South without its native people. He spent his final years, right up to 1831, trying to rally folks against it, writing letters, pleading his case. But here's the thing, not enough listened. Everts died, and as historian Francis Paul Prucha put it, the fight from the Christian side pretty much died with him. What Jackson's law did was flip the script on those treaties the tribes had signed. Those agreements were supposed to guarantee their land, their rights, but now, with a stroke of a pen, that was all out the window. The idea was to get these tribes, the ones they called the Five Civilized Tribes, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, out of the way entirely. These weren't random groups either. They'd built lives, adopted bits of European ways, farming, trading, even writing constitutions in some cases. But to Jackson and his backers, that didn't matter. The Southeast was prime real estate, and they wanted it, empty of its original owners. The plan wasn't gentle persuasion either. It was pressure, promises of cash, and government help if they'd just leave. But really it was a shove. Refuse, and you'd be dragged out anyway. The trails they'd walk, those winding paths west, weren't some scenic road trip. They were rough, unforgiving routes, cutting through forests, over mountains, across rivers, places where a wrong step or a bad storm could end you. And end it did for thousands. The Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian doesn't pull punches. When they look at this, they've got the records, the stories from survivors, the numbers of graves left behind. And they say it straight. This was genocide. A deliberate move to break these communities apart. Now, you might wonder how a law like this even got legs. It wasn't just Jackson's signature that made it real. It was a whole system backing him up, years of tension building, and a country shifting fast. Settlers were pouring into the Southeast, and they weren't about to let treaties stand in their way. Something big was brewing behind all this, something tied to money and power, and it's what fueled this whole tragedy. This wasn't just some random president signing a law because it landed on his desk. Andrew Jackson was the driving force, the architect of this whole thing. And to understand why, we've got to look at who he was and what he'd been up to, long before he ever stepped into the White House. Picture him back in his army days, a general with a reputation that wasn't exactly warm and fuzzy when it came to Native people. He'd spent years leading military campaigns against them, stomping through places like the Southeast, taking on tribes with a kind of ruthless energy that stuck with him. This wasn't a one-off battle here or there. It was a pattern, a string of fights that left a trail of blood and broken promises, way before he ever thought about politics. Fast forward to the 1820s, and Jackson's not wearing a uniform anymore, but he's still got that same fire. For at least a decade before he became president, starting way back around 1819 or so, he was out there loud and proud, pushing this idea of Indian removal. He wasn't shy about it either. He'd talk to anyone who'd listen. Politicians, settlers, newspapers, you name it, saying the native tribes needed to go, that they were in the way of progress, that their lands belonged to the growing United States. By the time he ran for president, this wasn't just a side issue for him. It was his mission. He won the election in 1828, took office on March 4th, 1829, and from day one, he made it crystal clear. Getting those tribes out of the Southeast was his top job. No waiting around, no second thoughts. He hit the ground running. Once he's in charge, Jackson doesn't waste time. He's got this law, the Indian Removal Act, drafted up and pushed through Congress by 1830. But he's also got a way of selling it that sounds almost noble, if you don't look too close. In one of his speeches, he lays it out like this: it will separate the Indians from immediate contact with settlements of whites, free them from the power of the states, enable them to pursue happiness in their own way and under their own rude institutions. Sounds nice, right? Like he's doing them a favor, giving them a fresh start out west where they can live their lives, free and easy. But let's not kid ourselves. That's the polished version, the one he fed to the public to make it all seem fair and square. The real story, it's a lot messier, and it's got a lot more to do with what was in it for him and his supporters. What's really behind this? Greed, plain and simple. 2 years before, he signed that law back in 1828. Gold popped up near Dahlonega, Georgia, right smack in Cherokee territory. Suddenly, miners and prospectors are flooding in, itching to get their hands on it, and they don't care that it's native land protected by treaties. Jackson's not about to stop them either, because that gold means money, power, and a bigger, richer America, at least for the settlers. Then there's cotton, the other big player. The South's turning into a cotton machine, thanks to Eli Whitney's cotton gin from way back in 1793. And plantation owners are hungry for more land to plant. Native territory, with its fertile soil, is looking like the perfect spot to expand those fields. So Jackson's not just moving people out of kindness. He's clearing the way for cash, and he's got plenty of folks cheering him on for it. But not everyone's clapping. This law didn't sail through Congress without a fight. It was a slugfest, a real knockdown, drag-out debate that split people right down the middle. Davy Crockett, the Tennessee congressman, who'd made a name for himself, as a tough frontiersman, steps up and says no way, he's not buying Jackson's shiny excuse. When the vote comes, on May 26, 1830, he's against it, and he's blunt about why. He says flat out that casting that vote against the act is something he'll never be ashamed of. Not even on Judgment Day. That's a big deal coming from a guy like Crockett, who's got a reputation to protect. Then you've got Jeremiah Everts, a Christian missionary who's been watching this unfold with a sinking heart. He calls it what it is, a morbid vision of a South stripped of its native people. He's writing, preaching, begging people to see the wrong in it, dedicating his last years, right up to his death in 1831, to stop it. Problem is, he's pretty much alone. Most of his missionary buddies don't join the fight. And as historian Francis Paul Prucha points out, when Everts dies, that Christian push against removal dies with him. Jackson, though, he's not sweating the opposition. He's got the votes, he's got the power, and he's got a vision of his own, one where the Southeast is wide open for settlers, miners, and planters. That speech about happiness and freedom for the tribes, it's a cover, a way to dress up something ugly in pretty words. Because when you peel it back, this isn't about helping anybody. It's about taking, plain and hard. He'd been at this game since his general days, fighting native tribes on the battlefield, and now he's just switched weapons, using laws instead of guns. By the time he's done, thousands are going to pay for it with their lives. All so a few could cash in on gold and cotton. Gold popped up near Dahlonega, Georgia in 1828, and that's when things really started heating up. This wasn't just any patch of dirt, it was Cherokee land, territory they'd held on to through treaties with the U.S. government. But once word got out about that shiny stuff in the ground, it was game on. Mining companies rolled in, prospectors showed up with picks and pans, and a whole mess of folks started squatting. There, treaty or no treaty. They didn't care that this was someone else's home. Land the Cherokee had every right to, under the law. All they saw was a chance to get rich quick, and they weren't about to let a peace stop them. By the time Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act 2 years later, that gold rush was already in full swing, turning a quiet corner of Georgia into a chaotic free-for-all. It's not hard to see why he'd want the Cherokee out of the way. Their land wasn't just dirt anymore. It was a jackpot waiting to be claimed. Then there's cotton, the other half of this greedy equation. Way back in 1793, a guy named Eli Whitney came up with the cotton gin, a little machine that changed everything. Before that, separating cotton fibers from the seeds was a slog. A slave working by hand could barely crank out a pound of cotton in 10 or 12 hours, back-breaking work that kept production slow. But Whitney's invention, it turned that into 50 pounds a day, like flipping a switch. From a crawl to a sprint, suddenly, cotton wasn't just a crop, it was king, with free labor from slavery, and this new gadget spitting out cotton faster than anyone could have dreamed. The South transformed into an agricultural beast. Plantation owners couldn't get enough of it, their fields stretching wider every year, their pockets getting fatter. Problem was, they were running out of room, and their eyes started drifting toward native lands, places like Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek territories, with rich, fertile soil perfect for planting. That combo, slavery plus the cotton gin, didn't just make the South powerful, it made it hungry. By the 1820s and 1830s, cotton was the backbone of the economy. Down there, a period folks call the antebellum South, all fancy and prosperous on the surface. But underneath, it was a machine that needed fuel, and that fuel was land. The treaties protecting native territories started looking less like sacred agreements and more like obstacles to these planters. They weren't about to stop at the edges of their own property lines when they could see all that untouched ground, just sitting there begging for cotton fields. So the push began, settlers and plantation owners creeping in, staking claims, and pressuring the government to do something about the tribes standing in their way. Jackson's Indian Removal Act was the answer they'd been waiting for. A green light to take what they wanted, without the hassle of negotiating or pretending to care about those old promises. But here's where it gets tricky. The Supreme Court stepped in and tried to put the brakes on this land grab. On March 3, 1832, in a case called Worcester v. Georgia, they ruled loud and clear, occupying native land in Georgia without a permit was illegal. The court said the Cherokee had rights, that the state couldn't just barge in and take over, that those treaties actually meant something. It was a big win. On paper, a moment where you'd think justice might have had a shot, except it didn't. Settlers didn't pack up and go home. They kept right on squatting, mining and planting like nothing happened. And Jackson, he didn't lift a finger to enforce it. He could have sent federal troops in to kick those intruders out, but he didn't. Why? Because doing that would have sparked a fight with the Georgia militia, a bunch of armed locals, ready to defend their claims tooth and nail. Jackson wasn't about to risk that kind of showdown, not when he could just sidestep the whole mess with his removal plan. So instead of upholding the law, he doubled down on clearing the tribes out. The gold in Dahlonega wasn't going anywhere, and the cotton boom was only getting bigger. By 1830, when he signed that act, the Southeast was a pressure cooker, settlers pouring in, treaties crumbling under the weight of greed. The cotton gin had turned a slow drip of profit into a flood, and slavery kept the costs low, making every acre of native land a gold mine in its own right. Jackson's solution wasn't to protect what was legally theirs, it was to hand it over to the people who'd profit most. That Supreme Court ruling, it was a speed bump he ignored, letting the settlers and planters run wild while he set the stage for the tribes to be hauled off. Gold and cotton weren't just economic drivers. They were the fuel that lit the fire under this whole tragedy, and Jackson was more than happy to fan the flames. The Indian Removal Act didn't just slide through without a fight. When it hit Congress in 1830, It was like tossing a match into a pile of dry leaves. People were split right down the middle, arguing loud and long about whether this was right or wrong. This wasn't some quiet vote where everyone nodded and moved on. It was intense, messy, and divisive, with folks on both sides digging in their heels. You had settlers and planters cheering for it, sure, because they saw gold and cotton fields on the horizon. But there were others, a smaller bunch, who saw something else, a massive injustice, unfolding right in front of them. And they weren't afraid to stand up and say it, even if it meant going against the tide. Take Davy Crockett, for instance. Yeah, the same guy you might know from Frontier Stories, the coonskin cap legend. He wasn't just some backwoods hunter. Turned congressman from Tennessee, he had a spine and a conscience. When the act came up for a vote, on May 26, 1830, he didn't hesitate. He said no, flat out, and he wasn't shy about why. He told anyone who'd listen that he'd cast that vote against it and never feel a shred of shame, not even if he had to face Judgment Day itself. That's not just talk, that's a guy putting his whole reputation on the line. Crockett knew what was at stake. He'd seen the native tribes in his own state, knew they weren't just obstacles to progress. To him, this was about right and wrong, and he wasn't about to let Jackson's law steamroll over that without a word. Problem was, he was in the minority. Congress was stacked with folks who either bought Jackson's pitch or just wanted the land too bad to care. Then there's Jeremiah Everts, a Christian missionary who took this fight to a whole different level. This guy wasn't in Congress. He didn't have a vote, but he had a voice, and he used it. He looked at Jackson's plan and didn't see progress. He saw something dark, a morbid vision of a South, wiped clean of its native people. That phrase wasn't just dramatic. It was how he felt, watching a whole population get pushed out for profit. Everts wasn't content to sit quiet either. He spent his last years, right up until he died in 1831, trying to stop it. He wrote letters, articles, anything he could get out there, pleading with people to see what was really going on. He'd argue that this wasn't just about land. It was about humanity, about the soul of a nation that claimed to be fair and free. But here's the tough part. He was mostly alone. You'd think a missionary might rally a crowd of church folks to his side, but that didn't happen. Most of his peers, the other missionaries, either stayed silent or didn't see it his way. He was a lone voice shouting into the wind, and when he passed away in 1831, that wind just kept blowing. Historian Francis Paul Prucha put it pretty starkly later on. He said, "The Christian crusade against Indian removal, the one Everts tried to lead, basically died with him." That's not an exaggeration either. Once Everts was gone, you don't see a big wave of preachers or church groups picking up where he left off. Whatever momentum he'd built fizzled out, leaving Jackson's plan to roll forward, unchecked. It's not that no one cared. Crockett and Everts prove that. But caring wasn't enough. The opposition was loud, it was passionate, it was rooted in real conviction, but it was small. Congress had the numbers. On Jackson's side, the settlers had the greed, and the plantation owners had the cotton dreams. Crockett could vote no, Everts could write his heart out, but they were up against a machine that wasn't stopping for anything. And that's the thing about this fight. It wasn't even close. The act passed on May 28, 1830, just 2 days after Crockett cast his vote, and Jackson signed it into law that same day. All that debate, all that division, and it still went through. The folks who opposed it didn't have the muscle to turn the tide, not in Congress, not in the churches, not anywhere that mattered. Crockett went back to Tennessee, eventually lost his seat over stuff like this, and Everts was in the ground by the next year. Meanwhile, the tribes they were trying to stand up for, they were already facing the fallout, treaties ignored, homes taken, and a long road west waiting. The opposition failed, not because they didn't try, but because the stakes were too high and the power was too lopsided. The 5 civilized tribes were the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. They got that name because they adopted European ways like farming and trading. By 1830, they'd signed treaties that cut their lands way down, but Jackson wanted them all out of the Southeast. The Choctaw went first. They once held land across Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, down to 11 million acres by 1829. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek signed September 27, 1830, effective early 1831, took the rest. Chief George W. Harkins wrote, "We as Choctaws rather choose to suffer and be free than live under the degrading influence of laws which our voice could not be heard in their formation." Removal started November 1st, 1831, led by George Gaines, with 17,000 forced out in 3 phases. From Memphis and Vicksburg, winter 1831, brought rain, sleet, snow, and floods. They got boiled corn, 1 turnip, and 2 cups of water a day. The Memphis group went 60 miles to Arkansas Post, stopped by frozen rivers, and many died. 40 wagons took survivors to Little Rock. The Vicksburg group got lost in Lake Providence swamps with a bad guide. Between 2,500 and 6,000 died. About 5,000 to 6,000 stayed in Mississippi, facing harassment and violence. A chief told a Little Rock journalist the journey had been a trail of tears and death. The Seminole were next. The Treaty of Payne's Landing, signed May 9, 1832, said they'd move west and join the Creek. 7 chiefs agreed March 28, 1833, but later said they were forced or didn't have authority. On December 28, 1835, Seminoles and freed slaves ambushed 110 U.S. soldiers in the Dade Massacre, leaving 3 alive. They fought guerrilla style from 1835 to 1842. The U.S. burned their farms to starve them. By the early 1840s, many were dead or surrendered and sent west, with deaths on the way. Some hid in the Everglades, calling themselves the Unconquered People. The Chickasaw cut a deal in 1837, buying land in Choctaw territory for $530,000 approved by Congress at Jackson's push. Their trip went better, but 500 to 800 still died from tough conditions. The Creek signed the Treaty of Cuseta on March 24, 1832, splitting their land into allotments they could sell and leave or stay under state laws. Speculators cheated them, so in 1836, some raided settlers. General Winfield Scott forced out nearly 20,000, and 3,500 died on the trail. The Cherokee were last. The Treaty of New Dakota, signed December 29, 1835, got 2,000 moving by 1838. That winter, General Scott, under Martin Van Buren, marched 15,000 more over 1,000 miles with little clothing and no shoes. Cholera spread, towns banned them, and settlers robbed them. At the Ohio River Ferry on December 3, 1838, they paid $1 instead of 12 cents and waited under Mantle Rock, where many died. They sued the U.S. for $35 per murdered person's burial. 4,000 died from hunger, disease, cold, and violence. A Georgia volunteer said, "I fought through the Civil War and saw thousands slaughtered, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew." From 1831 to 1838, about 20,000 indigenous people died because of the Indian Removal Act. That's the count we have, but the real number could be higher. It's not just the marches that killed them. Hunger, disease, and cold did the job, and the violence didn't stop there. The ones who didn't go west, who stayed behind in places like Mississippi or Florida, had it rough. Militias, government officials, and settlers kept coming after them. They faced harassment nonstop, legal battles to strip what little they had left, and straight-up attacks that left people hurt or dead. This wasn't a one-time event that faded away, it dragged on. A slow grind that kept the pressure on anyone who survived. The U.S. government, they've never said sorry. Not officially, not for the act itself. No big speech, no formal statement, owning up to what happened. You'd think with 20,000 dead and a trail of misery stretching across 9 states, there'd be something direct, but there isn't. The closest they got was on December 19, 2009, tucked away in the Defense Appropriations Act. Page 45 of a 67-page document buried where most wouldn't even look. There's this line: "The United States, acting through Congress, apologizes on behalf of the people of the United States to our native peoples for the many instances of violence, maltreatment, and neglect inflicted on native peoples by the citizens of the United States." That's it. No mention of the Trail of Tears. No specifics about the act, just a vague nod to violence, maltreatment, and neglect. People called it out right away. Said it was weak, hidden on purpose, a half-hearted shrug instead of a real reckoning. Critics were right. It doesn't name the thing, doesn't face it head on. and that's where it's sat ever since. In 1987, Congress marked 200 miles across 9 states as the Trail of Tears, National Historic Trail. It covers the routes 17 Cherokee groups took, a mix of land and water paths, from the southeast to Oklahoma. Then in 1991, Jerry Ellis, an author with Cherokee roots, walked 900 miles of that same journey from 1838. He wrote about it in Walking the Trail, a book that got nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. Schools still use it to teach this history. Out of everyone forced on those trails, about 1/3 didn't make it, dead before they hit the end, from hunger, cold, or violence. This wasn't an accident. It was a planned, hard-hearted move against Native people. Today, there's still a push for the U.S. government to own up to what it did, to call this humanitarian crisis what it was, and take responsibility. The whole story here boils down to this. The Trail of Tears wasn't just a sad chapter. It was a deliberate choice, driven by greed and power, one that cost thousands of lives and left a stain that's never been fully faced. It's about what happens when a government picks profit over people and then looks the other way for centuries. That's the point we're driving home. So you walk away knowing this isn't just history. It's a lesson still echoing today. If you found this worth your time, please like and subscribe to the channel for more.